All right, so we're going to do the notes for Unit 4, The Flowering of Romanticism. Romanticism has a lot to do with not only nature, but emotion and experimentation, and we're going to look at what these people believed a little more in these notes. Your essential questions for this unit. First of all, what can nature offer us? As the 19th century dawned, England's cities underwent tremendous growth. Urban life had advantages, but some observers worried about the negative consequences of so many people leaving the countryside and losing contact with the natural world. Today, the idea of going outside and back to nature holds great appeal to many. Why are people so drawn to nature? So we're going to look in the next slide. You can take a second to ponder that, but in the next few slides after the essential questions, we're going to talk about what it is about nature that draws people to it, and what is it. These people were looking for answers about the new industrial world, which was very, very new and rapidly changing, in nature, which seems counterproductive. Our second essential question is, how do you define beauty? Beauty was a topic of great interest during the Romantic period. Writers, artists, and others sought to discover beauty not only in such conventional places as nature and the arts and human form, but also in such abstract concepts such as emotions, ideals, and the human spirit. Some writers even explored the idea of beauty in failure and tragedy. What does it mean for something to be described as beautiful? How do definitions of beauty vary from person to person and culture to culture? How can science go wrong? The Enlightenment ushered in a new era of scientific progress and confidence in the power of humanity over the natural world. With advances, however, came new responsibilities and new dilemmas, many of which still concern scientists and society today. What happens when scientific discoveries or experiments result in harm or get out of control? When do the risks of pursuing scientific advancements outweigh the benefits of society? Who gets to define ethical scientific practices? A few things that come to mind with this one are all of our excursions to space. In America, for example, out of the so many attempts to go to space, especially the moon, several space shuttles with people in them have died. Or if we're talking about the nuclear bomb, how many people died with this creation? And the list goes on and on. Henrietta Lacks is another example of this in terms of taking human tissues and illegally and killing people to do experiments, if you're looking at the Nazis. So it's just something to consider. So how can science go wrong, and when do we say khalas? The last essential question for this unit is, what shapes your outlook on life? One hallmark of Romanticism is its focus on individual feelings and personal experiences. As humans, we're often shaped by our most emotionally intense experiences. Still, it's not the experience alone that molds perspective. Two people can live through the same event and come away with it completely different perspectives based on their outlooks in life or how they view and interact with the world. If experience cannot account for all the differences in perspectives, what can? So what is it that actually makes us have different perspectives on things? So now we're going to get into the brunt of the culture for these notes. The flowering of Romanticism. George III was the ruler of Britain during this time. He was not a very great king. Now, George III is a very special king, very incompetent. He's mostly blamed for the loss of the American colonies because he was so stubborn. When the colonies were demanding certain things or requesting more rights, he refused to give them to them, and he refused to compromise. Instead, he chose to let them leave, essentially. Well, he lost, but you get the idea. He died in 1820. Nobody really cares. French Revolution in 1788. Now, prior to this, the French Revolution comes after the American Revolution, but the French Revolution shocked many Romantic writers. At first, early Romantic writers and poets felt sympathy for the French Revolution. They loved the idea of liberty, equality, brotherhood, get the rights, everybody deserves these rights, you're right to fight for them, etc. They saw the revolution as a turning point in human history, with the move towards ideal civilized society in which those who had previously struggled or been oppressed would find relief, right? So you're looking at your farmers, when we talked about the Anglo-Saxons, for example, in the feudal system, those peasants that were at the very bottom, now's their chance to breathe. Now, during the Reign of Terror, which is a particularly dark part of the French Revolution, radical revolutionaries persecuted and massacred thousands of French aristocrats, or the rich people, and middle-class citizens. Now, this is the official turning point of where Romantics stop supporting the French Revolution, because it went from being this idealistic, fight the man, we're going to get our rights, to they just killed a bunch of people for apparently no reason other than the fact that they had money. And that scared a lot of Romantics, and that's where they drew the line. The British ruling classes especially were afraid that any efforts to reform society could lead to anarchy, as it did in France, and a bunch of people could end up dying in France. And so Romantics that were previously supporting the revolution now start to tiptoe around this idea. Now, the downside of industry, the Industrial Revolution during this period is pretty big. England is changing constantly. Cities like Manchester, and not so much London, but Manchester especially, is starting to really be developed, and a lot of factories are being built, which gives rise to the middle class. However, in the process of creating this industrialized nation, we're still focusing on agriculture as well. The Industrial Revolution and improvements in farming brought increased prosperity to the middle and upper classes, but brought degrading poverty to the families employed in factories and mills. A lot of the literature in this period focuses on life in the mills. There's numerous short stories and longer texts that talk about this class of people, this middle class of people that worked in these factories that just were, it was just such horrible work for next to no money. And it was very dangerous. People in the factories didn't care if your arm got cut off in a machine, because there was another person at the door that looked just like you that could do the work. So there's like this idea that people are disposable, kind of like you would throw away a water bottle once you used it. That's how people are. Now, living and working conditions are appalling. You may be familiar with this in the sense of child laborers, because some machines could only be cleaned by children, and then children would go and they'd be inside the machine, and the machine would get turned on, and then they would die, or they'd get stuck in a chimney, or whatever horrible death that a child could face at this time. But they're just, in general, it's very dangerous. Shortly after George III's son took control as regent or king, an economic depression resulted in the loss of many factory jobs. So the economy more or less crashed, and we lost a ton of jobs. And to add to this, because as technology advances, more jobs were lost. Because if, for example, we're talking about making clothes, right? To make cloth, it used to take one person hours at this machine where they had to pedal with their feet and essentially connect all the threads together, right? But then if you do some research on this, you see these huge machines were made where a cloth that would have taken hours for one person to make years before now takes just, maybe 20 minutes, not even. And you need far fewer people to get the work accomplished now, which can be problematic if you're a working class citizen. Romantic writers often sympathized with the oppression of the lower classes and wrote about their plight. Like I said earlier, there are numerous texts in which people are writing about the harsh conditions in the mills, especially. But these people really, really focused on the poor, just in general, not just in the mills, but across the board. Many of the Romantic writers reacted to the harsh realities of industrialization by turning to nature for truth and beauty. We do get, I want to tiptoe around this a little bit, because while Romantics are seen as being very much making everything glorious, there is a group of writers that kind of come from this. I guess dark Romantics would be the appropriate title for them, that focus on the dark aspects, where they're still looking towards nature, but they're pointing out, hey, this is messed up. So as we read, just be aware of this as well. Now, they revolted against the order, propriety, and traditionalism of the Age of Reason, and rejected classical tradition, venerated the achievements of ancient Greece and Rome. Romantics were influenced by the same forces that gave rise to the American and French revolutions, and by the agitated for political, social, and economic change taking place in their own country. There's a little bit of discrepancy within this. A lot of the times they advocated for change, but they did it in a very harsh way. So, like, consider the people that protest by, bombing places, if it's not an effective protest, and so nothing ever gets accomplished. Similar thing with the Romantics. For Romantics, emotion became more important than any reason. Now, what we know from basic argumentation is that when your argument is filled with emotion, you don't have necessarily good reasoning. So imagine these people coming through with these strong, emotionally loaded arguments that kind of aren't taken seriously to an extent, because it's just so dramatic. Like, ugh, nobody wants to listen to this drama. Thus, they preferred styles of writing, however, it's reflected through their styles of writing that weren't as constrained. So we're talking about poetry. Free verse poetry could be an example of this. Lyric poetry is also an example, and it's more similar to songs, lyric poetry. Now, we're going to get into the next part of this, which is text specific. So the first texts we're going to study when I come back are the poems by William Wordsworth, very famous poet, very well known in the UK. And the essential question that goes with this is, what can nature offer us? So stop for a second and think about a time when you were in nature and you were fully absorbed in the present moment. What do you remember seeing, hearing, smelling, and how did it make you feel? Pause this video, take a couple minutes, think about it, talk about it with a partner, etc. Now, analyzing Romantic poetry. Romanticism, as we just learned earlier, is a literary movement that flourished in Britain and Europe in the 19th century. Unlike the neoclassical poets who preceded them, the Romantics emphasized the importance of an individual's subjective experience rather than the issues that concern society as a whole. So Romanticism focuses on, what is this one person going through? They don't care necessarily about the larger issue, but what is this person's struggle? Sometimes it does relate to a larger issue and it is brought up, but they're mostly focused on this thing. Their philosophy valued emotion, spontaneity, and imagination over reason, analysis, and orderliness. Now, again, the drama in these people is so extra, but it's what makes this period unique, because we went from reason, science, from a period where Newton was making, his big discoveries, and we have all these other scientists that are doing these great things, to this frilliness of emotion. And it's very different for this society.